Wow, we got Pat back. That's great. So, hello, everybody.
That's right. I'm back, baby.
Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Weave. Welcome to Starfleet Tactical. As always, I have with me Patrick Doyle. Now, there's a little story behind me going, hey, you're back. And that's because when Lissa started the countdown, Pat was nowhere to be found. He had been online, and then all of a sudden he was gone about the time it was time to start the show. And Lissa said, you want me to go ahead and start it? And I said, sure, let's go ahead and start. I'll just tap dance until Pat comes back. And then, so I'm surprised when Pat's here. What I'm not surprised about is the fact that neither Pat's employer nor my employer will agree to anything we have to say about Starship Combat, because frankly, they don't care. And I don't understand about their complete and utter lack of concern about Starfleet combat. But, I guess we just have to live with that.
Actually, I am reading a book that Andy recommended right now, just about how much our country doesn't care about that topic. And it's a little scary.
Yeah, I've got that too. I think the formation of Space Force is at least in part intended to make that better. But that having been said, we could go into Space Force, but we're not going to, because that's actually way too close to what I do in my day job, and the people who pay my paycheck would want me to talk with them before I had any sort of conversation about an actual real Space Force. Starfleet, I can talk about all day long.
So maybe I should be taking notes as I listen to this book. So when you can't be on, I don't know how much the Navy or my airline, for that matter, cares about suborbital and combat between here and the moon and stuff like that. But I could at least take notes on the book and report on what I've read, since I got it from a totally unclassified source. That's just a book I got on Amazon. It's just a book report. So.
Well, and so, actually, just for everybody else out there, another interesting piece of all of this is that Pat was emailing himself some photos that he was going to put into a presentation, and they didn't show up in his email, and then they started coming in out of order, etc. So the plan was for me to sort of kill time, stall for a little while Pat sort of put some stuff together, because he was finally getting that stuff. So I'll go ahead and do that. So Pat's going to sit there and work on PowerPoint slides for a few minutes while I talk about stuff. And since we've talked about Space Forces, there's a couple of books that I think I've mentioned before. But, one of the things about doing a show like this is that there's this weird little balance between, I don't want to constantly mention the stuff that I've mentioned before, right? Because then it'll get boring and you'll just hear the same stuff. But on the other hand, it's also kind of presumptuous to assume that that everybody heard it the first time, was paying attention the first time, that we never get new viewers, right? If things are going well, every episode we should have like 90% of our people are new people that have joined just since the last week, and we'll be at 1 million subscribers. I'll answer that in just a second, Stephen. The short answer is yes. So that there's always this this sort of tension between referencing stuff again and not referencing it again. And then there's the other part where I have to remember what exactly I said the last time and what I didn't say. And
probably the real challenge, right?
Yeah, that's actually the real challenge. In fact, it's gotten so bad, as Pat knows, but the rest of you don't. I finally created a document on our OneDrive setup where I basically just say, this is what we talked about this week. So if we need to go back and find it again, we can. So I'm going to talk about Space Forces in just a second. Books, science fiction books that have Space Forces. I'll answer Stephen Ross's question real quick. Yeah, they use signal lamps all the time. It's still a good way to talk to a ship that's nearby. You do it in circumstances where you don't want to get on the radio. I've actually, I've been on a ship where they use signal flags also. So they'll use an Aldous lamp, or they're flipping the little handle and they do signal flags. One of the things about signal flags that most people haven't necessarily thought of unless you had to do it is that signal flags aren't one system, they're two systems. because you have to learn how to send it, but you also have to learn how to receive it, which is, of course, exactly the opposite of how you're sending it, right? It's a mirror image. So you have to understand that, like, when you see them doing it, the flag is like this. When you send it, the flag is like this, right? So it actually can be a little complicated. I did stand next to an ensign on board one ship who was having the signal guy send a message using signal flags to her boyfriend, who was an ensign on the other ship. So they were both in the same squadron, but they were on different ships. And so they were sending messages back and forth via signal flags, which I actually thought was really seriously cool. So a few books about Space Forces. So these are books that I've read that I really, really enjoy, that sort of talk about Space Forces. They all have the attribute of a U.S. Space Force. There's two books that I always read back to back that are about the creation of Space Forces. One is by Larry Bond and Chris Carlson. So Chris Carlson was on the show a month ago-ish, something like that. And that's a book called Lash Up. And in Lash Up, there's a situation going on where GPS satellites are being destroyed. They figured that out really early. I'm not going to give, I'll give you spoilers for like up through chapter 2. They discovered that GPS satellites are being plinked, and they end up creating a Space Force in secret in order to implement all the defensive measures that they need to deal with that. And that includes bringing Venture Star out of mothballs and basically getting Venture Star up so that it can go play defense against those satellites, against the things that are attacking the satellites. And it's a seriously cool book. It started off as a novella that Larry Bond had written. Chris Carlson expanded it into a novel. Chris was the guy who hired me at DIA for a job that involved what's called acquisition threat support. And so that means that we were intel people that supported the acquisition process. And so if you read that stuff, if you read this book, you'll actually get an idea of how different pieces of the acquisition process work, because they're trying to basically circumvent the acquisition process and the requirements process, right? Legally, when you're going to buy weapons, there's a certain process you have to follow. A lot of people look at it and say, oh, it's all this paperwork, it's all this red tape, etc. But what it's actually trying to do is to make sure that when you spend $1 billion, that you get $1 billion worth of effect for the money that you've spent, right? It's really tough to spend $1 billion efficiently. And it's actually even more than $1 billion. If I remember correctly, the threshold for acquisition category 1D, which is the sort of stuff we dealt with, was like 2.34 billion, if I remember correctly, or 2.37 or something like that. It changes over time, but they were the really expensive programs. That was the small programs to get into. So it's things like F-35 and the Columbia class and the Virginia class and major weapon systems. And so, like, at one point, there's an Air Force general saying, "You can't do that. You're skipping all these steps, and that's illegal." And it's like, I got a letter from the president that says I can go ahead and pass go and collect $200 on my way. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. The next novel that I always read is a novel by a guy named Thomas Mays, who is a captain in the U.S. Navy. And it's called A Sword into Darkness. And it's based upon the idea that the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, there's this weird astronomical effect that's being observed. It's a very bright light that seems to be monochromatic. And the Silicon Valley entrepreneur is convinced that it's a spacecraft coming it's a decelerating, slower than light starship that's coming to Earth. And he can't convince NASA that this is what's going on. NASA just doesn't want to believe in aliens. They refuse to say aliens. They just won't do it. And so he says, well, shit, I'm a billionaire. Yeah. I'll solve this problem myself.
Nowadays, they won't even say UFO.
Yeah.
It's UAP.
Yep. So I'll tell you in just a second about I'll talk about the DIA UFO thing in just a second.
All right.
But so in any event, he's convinced it's a decelerating spacecraft, and so he hires a former naval officer to run the research project, going around trying to get people, giving money, seed money to people in the hope that they can all develop the technologies necessary to build a starship to go out and meet these guys and be prepared just in case they're hostile. And so basically, they spend the next 30 years prepping for this, or 20 some years prepping for this. And as it turns out, eventually NASA concludes, oh shit, it is a spacecraft. And the U.S. government goes, oh shit, it would have been great if we had prepared for it. At which point he goes, hey, guess what? I did. I prepared for it. We're ready. And it's a fantastic book, and hopefully Tom will retire. The Navy's really cramping my style. I really want to see the sequel to this, but they keep promoting him. And as a result, he stays in the Navy and he can't finish the sequel. So
I would love to see a sequel to that book. That was a really good book. Sword into Darkness is good. Lash Up is really good. They're both fun books. They're totally different stories, but both good books. Really good.
And so two other things that I'll talk about that sort of fit in the same category. There's a couple of books by a guy named John Lumpkin. The first one is Through Struggle the Stars, and I can never remember what the title of the second book is, but if you look up Through Struggle the Stars, you'll find the first one. That is not a creation of a Space Force, but the Space Force had been created in the recent past, and there's some culture clash that happens because you've got a bunch of guys that used to be Air Force and a bunch of guys that used to be Navy, and now they're in one service, and they're sort of trying to figure out what that means, right? And so this is different from when the Air Force split off from the Army, because the Air Force, it was the Army Air Corps, right? So they were all Army guys that also had this air spin on them. As a result, they were reasonably monocultural. It wasn't like trying to take, here's a bunch of Navy guys, here's a bunch of Air Force guys, mix them together and see what you get. And so they're busy so there's lots of places where they're sort of clashing with each other, and they're not quite all on the same page, and they're trying to figure out how to work that out. And in the process of this, he tells a story about a war that, the first major space war that takes place between the various human factions, has a really cool set of technology that's based upon wormholes being moved by slower than light starships to other star systems, and then you feed mass through the wormholes to make them bigger, and so that the size of the wormhole limits the size of a ship that can go through it. So all starships have a tendency to be kind of long and thin because they have to fit through the wormhole, and that has some interesting implications. And Winchell Chung from Atomic Rockets of the Space Patrol fame, who you saw the triangle graph from Winchell Chung, and everybody knows Winch. If you go and he did the cover art for it, and there's a couple of other interesting bits and pieces that he was part of that. And the last thing I'll mention is a book that I knew about, but didn't actually read until Pat told me about it, which is Chain of Command by Frank Chadwick, and its sequel, Ship of Destiny. And in Chain of Command, the U.S. Navy has been a space-going force for a while, but they interstellar contact with aliens happened about 70 years in the past, and this is the first true interstellar war that's taking place. And those of you who are fans of Traveller and 2300 will recognize that Frank is borrowing some of those ideas from his youth as a game designer. But they're seriously cool books. And one of the things I really like about those two novels is that, when they do a turnover, when the watch officer comes on, they do a real no shit Navy turnover. Anybody who's ever been on a ship and watched them do that will go, yep, that's exactly how those things go. So it's really seriously cool. And I all the stuff I've mentioned, I recommend without reservation. So
yeah, those are both good books.
Pat,
I really enjoyed those.
did I stall long enough, Pat?
Oh yeah, I've been ready for like 10 minutes. So.
Okay, one other thing, and then then we'll start working our way into what we're going to talk about this week. So on my list of things to do is to still go back and add comments, etc., etc. I'm back at home, having spent 10 days in Iowa and getting caught up on some stuff there, and dealing with a family emergency there. I'm back home, and I will get to it because I do really want to go and do that. So every time I say this, people go, "Okay, yeah, that's great. We'd love to see that stuff." So I appreciate the positive feedback. I'm going to go ahead and do that. I just haven't gotten it yet. So my apologies for not getting it done yet. So, Pat, how's your week been? We haven't talked about your week at all.
My week, just working in the simulator. I worked this morning. I did a little bit of reading or research on our topic for today for about 45 minutes after work. And then I came home. Then I put in a stairwell in my deck, or not a stairwell, but stairs in my deck, and did that for several hours. Then we entertained some guests up until about a half hour ago. So yeah, that's been my day. Otherwise, week, just normal week, hanging out in the simulator and training people to fly airplanes and putting them through emergencies and whatnot. So it's been a good week, and it was 80 degrees here in Minnesota. So I got that going for me, which is nice.
I don't think it was quite that warm here. Yesterday when I checked, it was the high was supposed to be like 58, 59, something like that. I meant to go out and take a walk at some point today when it was bright and sunny. Mm-hmm. I just kind of spaced it.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with a lot of the aftermath of getting caught up. So I ran a professional wargaming conference. Well, professional for some value of professional, not an official thing, but it was for people who take wargaming seriously. The 12th through the 14th. It's called Connections Online. If you want to watch it, almost all of it was recorded and is up on YouTube. So we put together this conference, and I'm still dealing with sort of the after action stuff from the conference. So making sure that that a bunch of our processes, our SOPs, etc., are all documented, because that's really one of my victory conditions for this conference. I wanted to execute the conference without any technical glitches and make sure that all the processes were documented so that next time it's easier, and so that I can pass those off to some people that are running a similar conference in the near future. I have to go back and finish documenting some of that stuff. And there's a few little after action things that like collecting all the stats on how many people we had, etc. But it really came off without a hitch. Pretty much all the technology worked the way that we wanted it to. We did it with StreamYard, which is the same thing we used to do for this show. And StreamYard was its usual bulletproof self. I keep saying that one of these days I'm going to say it, and all the servers at the StreamYard location are going to catch on fire or something, because I keep tempting fate about how bulletproof it is. But I really, StreamYard really just works, and so it's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm not used to IT things working, but I do know that. Well, never mind. I won't say it, but I was gonna make a derogatory comment about certain agencies' IT infrastructure and stuff, but I'll refrain.
Oh, I was going to tell the DIA UFO story.
Oh yeah. I'm sure everyone. Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Which, my apologies if I've told the story on the show, because I just don't remember. But I'll go ahead and tell it again. So you may recall that about 4 years ago or so, or longer ago than that now, probably 5 or 6, there was an incident where it came out that the Defense Intelligence Agency had been involved with studying UFOs. And that was because a very, very senior member of Congress had specifically put it into the budget bill that we had to do this stuff. And so there was a bunch of reports that my office, this was before I got there, but my office had to do sort of the technical review for and manage the contract. So every now and then, other people from other agencies would make fun of DIA in my presence for writing the Stargates, the military utility of Stargates and wormholes. And I would have to, and I'd always
how did Stargates and wormholes come into the UFO Tic Tac type investigations?
So there were two pieces of it. There's all the video stuff, etc., and then there was technology that might be like from aliens, and some of it was like material science type stuff. And some of it was things like the military utility of Stargates and wormholes. We didn't pick the topics. We were told do reports on these things.
You're perfectly qualified. You're as qualified as anybody, right, to write that report?
Well, probably, but we actually
maybe more so.
There was a vendor that got to do all this stuff. We just did the technical review of it.
Okay.
And so none of this stuff is really available, although it's all pretty mundane. I mean, there's the stuff that's material science stuff where it'll say things like, oh, we'll have this in, we expect that we'll have this in 15 years. Some of the stuff we expect to have it in 20 years, and we've got it now. We got it like 5 years later. So, and then other stuff, it's like, what's the military utility of Stargates and wormholes? The answer was nada for a long, long time. Because we don't even know how to do that. And so that was an interesting thing. But I first found out about all this because when I was at the Naval War College, somebody had contacted Winchell Chung, and Winch had passed them on to me because they wanted to do a TV show on what might happen if aliens invaded the Earth. And so I saw a script. I gave him comments on a script. A bunch of us went to New York City. It was the group in New York City was me, Chuck Gannon, Michael Flynn, the science fiction writer, not the crazy former head of DIA. Who else was there? Stan Schmidt, who was the editor of Analog at the time. I'm missing somebody. There was another person there. Paul Levinson, who's got a PhD in communications and does some interesting stuff. And I think that's everybody who was there for that. And so we're going through the script and giving them comments on stuff. And they had things in it like the aliens were trying to alien form the planet by turning all the oxygen into argon. And yeah, that's exactly the look we all had. It's like,
okay.
Like, if you can do that, you probably don't need to go take over a planet. And
if you can travel across space, you probably got that one figured out by now, right?
Yeah, and so we had to explain to them things like, all the resources are available out there in space. As I explained, it's like you got to answer 4 questions. What do you want? Why do you want it? Why don't you have it already? And why is the right answer to take it from us? And, paradoxically, like any resource thing, you can get it from the asteroids, you can get it from the Kuiper Belt, there's all sorts of places where you can get it easier than coming to our gravity well and taking it from us.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the first country on our planet that hauls an asteroid into the Lagrange or into orbit and starts mining it pretty much wins.
Yeah. Huh. And they'll crash every commodities market known to man, but it'll be interesting. So my brother Delon, hello Delon. Yes, this is a pitch meeting T-shirt, or it's I don't know if it's an official one, but it's one that I bought. It does say super easy, barely an inconvenience. So in any event, so they're going they wanted to turn oxygen into argon, and we had to explain to them the idea of like, why is oxygen useful? The answer is it reacts with everything. And as a result, argon, which doesn't react with anything, is probably not a good breathing gas if you're trying to get energy out of it by having it react with things. And so we had to explain a lot of basic science and stuff. So they eventually came up with a script. They eventually shot it, and there were 3 different versions of it. There was a 2-hour British version, a 2-hour American version, and a 1-hour version that was episode number 2 or 3 of the Discovery Channel show Curiosity. And there was some other people that came in, like Michio Kaku and a couple of other people came in and did video things. I did some on-camera stuff too. David Bartels, who's a great guy who I happened to meet when I did the video stuff. He was the guy right before me. He's the guy who talks about how Michelle Rodriguez did the introduction. And he said he will tell people that his biggest regret about the show was that his love scene with Michelle Rodriguez was cut. Now, I was never within 500 miles of Michio Kaku during any of this. I think he recorded up in New York City. I recorded down in DC. And if you look at it, it looks like this bombed out basement. It was actually in a shopping mall. This is what it looks like when you see one of those big, they got the painted plywood up and it says coming soon, dress barn or something like that. And this is what it looks like on the other side. It looks like a bare basement with bare light bulbs, etc. It looks like, it's some like apocalyptic, rundown factory, etc. Old factory building. In reality, we had to tell the people in the restaurant next door, can you turn down the radio in the kitchen because it's bleeding over and it's showing up on our audio.
Hey, turn down your music. We're trying to film a show about aliens.
Yeah. And so they did 3 different versions of it. There's 2 2-hour versions, but the special effects are different between the 2 2-hour versions. And also, the 2-hour British version is longer than the 2-hour US version. Because neither of them, of course, is 2 hours because they actually have commercials, but the Brits have fewer commercials than we do. So the British 2-hour version is like 6 minutes or 8 minutes longer than the US 2-hour version. In any event, so they're going to do 2 shooting sessions. I get picked as one of the people for the second shooting session. They're going to do an initial one in New York City, and Chuck Gannon and Michio Kaku and all those people did that. And that one was a total nightmare because they were right under the path for LaGuardia. And so what was supposed to be like an hour-long shoot with
My
Chuck
apologies.
Gannon, what was supposed to be like an hour-long shoot with Chuck Gannon ended up being like a 5-hour ordeal because every time they would think they got a take, there'd be an airplane that would fly over. And
did they not think that was, I don't know. Do they not know where the airport is?
Chuck Gannon started off as a TV producer before he became a professor of literature and a writer. And he made the observation that one could probably conclude that somebody didn't do their job properly if they ran into this problem. It may have been that like when they scouted the place, the wind was in a different direction, and as a result, they were taking off and landing in the different direction. You would know better than I. You're muted.
Yeah, I could explain it. It's not that interesting. I mean, there's essentially 2 pieces of pavement. Depending on the winds, in LaGuardia, they land on one runway and they take off on the other runway that intersects, and it just rotates based on wind. Usually, they try not to land with tailwinds. So, I mean, that's generally the idea. But anyways, it depends.
I can come up with scenarios where it wasn't
an issue
screwing up, and I could come up with scenarios where it was somebody screwing up. So in any event, that was problematic. But I was back in. They held me and a couple of other people in reserve because they wanted to have us available to answer any questions. So the idea was they were going to do a rough cut of it, and if something came up, then they'd have one of their subject matter experts available to ask the question of, and they could get us on camera. Incidentally, they also had us do, like, the idea was that there wasn't going to be a narrator, so they'd ask us to do transitions. So on the one hand, they'd say like, well, tell us about such and such, and I'd tell them about such and such. And then the other thing they would they'd feed me lines that I would have to say. And so like one of them was, of course, the aliens didn't know that. And so they were going to piece these together into sort of pseudo narration. But in any event, so in between the time when I go to New York City and I consult on the script and I give them a bunch of feedback and I do my little screen tests and they decide that for some strange reason that you wanted to put me on camera, and the time when they're ready to actually have me do it, I switch jobs. I go to DIA. And so now I'm at DIA and it's like, I need to talk to DIA Public Affairs. So I send an email to DIA Public Affairs and said, hey, just to let you know, there's this crazy little thing for the Discovery Channel. It's about what might happen if aliens invade. And I'm not going to talk about the intelligence community or DIA or anything. If I'm going to use as my bona fides the fact that I was a former professor at the Naval War College. So I'm not even going to mention DIA. And it's just this cute little thing, and it's not really that big deal. And they effing freaked. I get these emails of like, what are you doing? Where's this coming from? How long has this been going on? Why didn't you tell us sooner? Blah, 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 blah. I'm just like, it's like they do this core dump. I get this email that's like 3 paragraphs long. That's like just, they're just like hair on fire. And it's like, what the hell? This was not what I was expecting, because Chris Carlson had told me, Chris writes novels. He writes techno thrillers, right? He does a game called Harpoon that's about modern naval combat. He's never had any problem with DIA Public Affairs or DIA pre-publication review. And he said, yeah, they're a joy to work with. They're competent people. They don't panic. And it's like, what the hell's going on? So I call up Chris and tell him the story, and I go, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, what's going on here? And he says, well, there's a story. You see, there's this UFO project, and Public Affairs is paranoid that this is going to get out. And they're trying to keep the lid on as long as possible about the UFO project. So that's why they're freaking. Oh, okay. Got it. So I went back to Public Affairs, and, I had a really good working relationship with DIA Public Affairs and DIA Pre-Publication Review. I made sure I kept them apprised of everything I was doing, everything I did with Bu9, every time I when I got interviewed by the Blog for Foreign Policy by Michael Peck to talk about aircraft carriers in space and Starship Enterprise versus aircraft carrier Enterprise. And, anytime I published articles with Bain, and when I did House of Lies or House of Steel, all that stuff, made sure they knew about all of it. Every time I got interviewed, made sure they knew about it. They were totally cool with the whole thing. Great working relationship. But it started off a little rocky because I totally and completely freaked on this. But it was really kind of entertaining. So in any event, that's the long version of the story about the entire alien invasion thing. And the funny thing is, there's 2 different alien invasion shows. There's actually 3. There had been one that had been done about 3 years previously, and then there was another one that involved John Ringo and Travis Taylor and a couple of other science fiction people, that was done by a rival company. Because you know how these things always work, right? Where all of a sudden three different studios do a movie on the same topic. It was one of those. In this case, somebody left the production company that was working with the Discovery Channel and went to another production company. And what do you know? The Science Channel does the show with this other production company. They actually got theirs out first. And it's got a similar title. Mine was Alien Invasion, Are We Ready? And there's also, I think, had Alien Invasion in the title too. So if you go and you look, you'll actually find there's 3 shows, two that came out almost back to back, and then another one that came out about 4 years previously. So in any event, that having been said, we should probably talk about Star Trek.
Perhaps, I mean, if you want to. A few years ago when a bunch of those shows came out, I just couldn't help getting the sense, like, is someone trying to train the public for something? Is there something we need to know? I mean, because there was just a whole string of these things that seemed like fairly serious documentaries, or an attempt at a fairly serious documentary, and then what was it, 2017 when the Tic Tac video came out and stuff like that. So,
I don't know what caused it for them to do this, but I didn't see any evidence of that. But
any evidence of what?
That it was part of a larger plot.
Right. No, I didn't think so either.
But by the way, with God as my witness, I didn't know about the exploding eyeballs. I learned about that the same time everybody else did when I watched it on the video.
Exploding eyeballs.
Yeah, the aliens had some genetic disease. They did bioweapons and they caused people's eyeballs to explode.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
So it was an interesting creative process because we're all tossing out ideas and we ended up going with some versus others. And in a few cases, they took it a little bit too literally. Like one of the things that we talk about, there's a famous incident that occurred with a nuclear weapons detonation where it blew the cover off of a hatch. And they think this thing ended up in orbit. And so we said, this is a way that you could actually use a nuclear weapon to send a bunch of projectiles into orbit, and that might be useful. And they interpreted it literally as they have a helicopter carrying a giant manhole cover because we talked about manhole covers, and it's like, no, just because that's what happened in the real world was they had basically this manhole cover doesn't mean that you're going to fire manhole covers. If you don't have anything better, you'd probably put a sphere. You might actually want to have something that looks like a projectile. Just like, it's basically a multi-barreled gun, right? It's expanding gases pushing a projectile. Last time I checked, nobody is armed with a gun that fires discs, that direction, right? Little tiny manhole covers out of their gun.
Yeah.
So it could have been better, but it was a very interesting process to watch how it all happened, and so a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I have Travis Taylor's book.
Yeah, he did an alien invasion book about that same time.
Yeah.
And I can't remember. I used to know the question about whether he ended up on the TV show because he had done the book or whether the book was something that he sort of pulled together after the TV show. Mm-hmm. I can't remember which was which on that, but I think it probably was the former, that's why they went to him, is because he had a book out on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it got weird because, it was John Ringo. So there was this long discussion about making sure there was a proper breeding supply of women afterwards. And, it's like, what? Okay, whatever. Just, I guess it was weird.
All right. So anyways, so we had planned to talk about the Deep Space Nine episode today, Tears of the Prophets. So I'll go ahead and set my screen up. Let's share it. Share screen. So, as time goes on, we'll periodically do little snippets of the Dominion War and talk about it. So we might not finish this one today, but we can always roll into it, finish it up next week, and maybe get in a little more detail that way too. So unfortunately, I did have a technical error that dropped all the slides that I had put together. So this is sort of the unfortunately quick redo. But Tears of the Prophets, if this were a Friends episode, I don't know if anyone remembers the show Friends, of course. The episodes are always named the one where, so this would actually probably be the one where Jadzia dies for, this is the season 6 finale in the episode. So we're more than a year into the war at this point. And so So we're not doing it necessarily in perfect sequence or anything, but anyway, so we're going to talk about this one. So ultimately, this is also the one where the Allies invade the system called Shintaka, and this is the first offensive thrust into Cardassia. They're finally at a point where they can go, contemplate going on the offensive, and so there's some little bit of discussion, some planning, and then they invade, and then they get the Federation, the Klingons, and the Romulans all working together to kick the Dominion out of their sandbox. So when the episode starts off, we've got Sisko and Ross and Martok talking, and basically they're just having a discussion. Sisko, clearly they imply that Sisko's been doing research for quite a while, obviously probably teams of intel officers and all that kind of stuff. There's probably a whole lot of work involved in all of this, but so they're just having the top level discussion. And, basically they've been looking for a weakness in Cardassia and the Dominion lines and stuff like that so that they can make an attack and, figure out where to hit the Dominion on and go on the offensive. Now, one of the important things when you're doing this sort of contemplating this is, normally you play a board game or a war game with somebody, you usually set up a balanced fight in a lot of cases, right? I mean, I want to have an equal chance of winning, and that's how you play games and that sort of thing. But, in warfare, it's, you don't really want to have a fair fight. You want to show up someplace where they least expect it with the fewest, the lowest possible resistance, completely kick their ass, take what you need, and then hopefully you don't lose too much, right? I mean, that's at least the goal. I like to joke that if you're fighting a fair fight, your tactics and probably your operational planning really sucks. So, or you just didn't have a choice. So anyways, the three of them are having a discussion, and they point out they're discussing Shintaka and the fact that there's only 5 squadrons of Jem'Hadar fighters protecting this system. So this seems like Weyoun and Weyoun and Damar are having arguments and discussions, and Weyoun is chiding Damar for saying things like, "Hey, you've spread our forces too much," and Damar responds, "Hey, the Romulans opened up a front, started attacking. We needed more forces there, so I sent it." And Weyoun is always obviously not exactly a big supporter of Damar or anything like that. So he's a political opportunist for the most part. So anyways, the three of them, Sisko and Admiral Ross and Martok, they get a bunch of staff involved and the Romulans, and they're having a discussion and a strategy session on what to do. So they're trying to decide whether to attack or not. And initially, the Romulans say, "Hey, let's let them keep coming and invading our territory. We'll just kill them every time they show up. And this way we don't have to lose anybody. It's going to be a bloodbath. We're going to be counting lots of dead people if we actually invade their territory." And then one side note I'd like to point out, notice that there's a guy in the old-fashioned uniform over here. So since you have replicated clothing and uniforms, I can't imagine that you couldn't just send the file to all the ships throughout the Federation. So I can only believe that different commands are allowed to choose and phase in the new uniforms as they desire. But we see, if you look in the background in this meeting, you see some of the old style next generation uniforms in the background. So I just thought that was an amusing little note. And also, it wouldn't be unlike one particular military service where the word uniform implies everyone's dressed the same, yet there are lots of choices of uniforms to choose from. So clearly the Federation has at least some measure of that going on too. So,
hey, Pat.
Yes.
I once asked one of my colleagues at the Naval War College when he was wearing a uniform I had never seen before. I said, "How many uniforms do you guys have anyway?" And so he grabbed a marker and went up to the whiteboard, and The answer was, at the time there were 16 different uniforms that he could wear, and we missed one.
Ah, yeah.
And some of them are highly specialized. My favorite being service dress Yankee, which is the jacket from one uniform and the slacks from another uniform, and is authorized only at yachting events. And then there's like the different cummerbunds for the dress uniform. Like there's one configuration if the president is going to be there, and another configuration if he isn't, and stuff like that. But it worked out to 16 different uniforms for the U.S. Navy. So
wow, that's impressive. We at least got rid of the blue digital camouflage uniforms, and now we just use the Type 3s.
And and they got rid of the Johnny Cashes, and they got rid of they've standardized. They've got it down to about 12. I think. So
yes, indeed.
And that's for aviation officers. It was 16.
Yeah, because they've got, kind of like a World War II looking.
Yeah, that's the one that Pete was wearing. I said, "What is this, Throwback Thursday?" And he goes, "No, fully authorized uniform, aviator greens, fully authorized." And I said, "Where the hell does this one come from? I've never seen this one before." But it wasn't a uniform that dated back to World War II. Technically, in World War II, they would wear a jacket and a tie when they're flying their fighter plane.
Yeah, exactly. A little more formal back then. I believe the RAF did the same thing, right? So
yeah, it's craziness. It's craziness. So,
yep. So, anyways, so they're trying to decide ultimately if they should invade, and finally Cisco and Ross, they counter that, hey, the only way to stop them is to destroy their shipyards, because they can breed Jem'Hadar faster than we can kill them. So they're going to exhaust us eventually, basically. So, if your opponent has essentially, unlimited supply, then yeah, you do have to destroy their ability to build and rebuild ships and breed Jem'Hadar and produce Ketracel White and all that sort of thing. So, and so eventually they decide, there's lots of insults. Martok almost jumps across the table at the smug Romulan guy. I mean, you kind of did want to put a dagger in that Romulan's chest. He was kind of an ass, but so I don't blame Martok really. But anyways, with allies like that, who needs enemies? So eventually they head into the Chintaka system, and unfortunately for the allies, the Damar and the Dominion, they have a new weapon there. So basically they have these orbital platforms. So these orbital platforms consist of regenerative shields. They have what appear to be 3 large disruptors on them, beam disruptors, and they have 1,000 plasma torpedoes. So they're very heavily armed devices, and they're orbiting around the planet Chintaka. And there are 2 habitable systems in this planet. So it appears to be a valuable system. And so the Klingons, the Feds, and the Romulans charge on into the system, and they think they're getting there before these platforms will go active. So they think they've still got some time. So then the Dominion, the few squadrons of Dominion ships come charging out and they go after the Klingons basically on the right flank. And so, and what they end up doing is so they're just trying to delay and cause as many casualties as they can. And they're essentially just sort of buying time for those orbital platforms to come online. So in the meantime, the Jem'Hadar fighters are just ramming Klingon ships and causing all sorts of mayhem among the fleet. So there's a couple of cool scenes of Jem'Hadar fighters cleaving Vorcha class cruisers in half, and I believe here we see that looks like the wing of a bird of prey. After a collision. So it's kind of a bloody thing. It ends up costing Martok about 15 of his ships either crippled or destroyed. There's another shot. This is actually a little bit later on, but this is a Vorcha that's been chopped up by these orbital platforms here. So, and you can see they've got the 3 spikes. There's disruptors that fire from each of those, and then the plasma torpedoes come from the center point here. So these things are not to be trifled with.
I was sort of surprised watching that episode. They made a big deal about it having 1,000 plasma torpedoes. Considering what a big deal that was, you saw surprisingly few plasma torpedoes being fired.
Yeah, I mean there was a scene where you're looking at the view screen of the from the Defiant, and you can see multiple torpedoes being launched by one of them, one of those platforms as it's hitting Defiant, and then you see the Defiant shaking a few times, so that implies it took a few more hits off screen. So. But yes, you do see those are clearly very powerful disruptors because you see those things cutting things in half in several cases. So there's another scene. So as it turns out, they do come online before before they can destroy them all. So the Allies got in some opening shots and take out a few of them. Then they come online and they just start chopping through the Allied ships. Here you can see one of them firing at a Miranda. The Mirandas always have the best, coolest deaths, as far as I can tell. I mean, they just get slaughtered in these battles. So here's another one firing clearly right on the bridge. So not that anyone was going to survive that mess anyways, but yeah, they definitely take a beating. And in one of the other ones, we see a Galaxy class flying by, shooting at one, and this picture didn't turn out too good, but this thing gouges a couple holes in the Galaxy class. So I'd like to point out, so the Galaxy class, I have not seen a Galaxy class get destroyed on screen in Deep Space Nine. So except for during the war, except for the Odyssey, which got destroyed in like season 3 or something like that. But during the actual war, I don't believe we ever see a Galaxy get destroyed. So I like to think of that as further proof that, when configured for wartime, they probably get rid of the science labs and the kindergartens, and they probably don't waste the space on that sort of stuff, and probably pack it with some more weaponry. And if you read some beta canon, it talks about it getting some additional weaponry. For the Dominion War. And a lot of the interior hull space just ends up being empty because they don't need the science labs. They just need a lot of guns and shield generators and all that sort of stuff. So there's probably the galaxies that are fighting in the Dominion War are probably somewhat upgraded over the Enterprise D from the Next Generation.
Yeah, and those ones that had the big empty spaces in it, I think those were cases where they were space frames that they didn't take out science labs. They never put them in.
They just never put them in. Yeah,
they were space frames under construction when the war happened, and they said, I think we need warships more than we need explorers right now. So we'll just leave that shit out.
Yeah, let's just throw some extra shield generators or whatever else they can stuff in there that might be useful for fighting. So, but the Galaxy it's got 3 fairly large shuttle bays. So they could be carrying peregrines. You have the Akiras, which carry a squadron. So that would explain why we see peregrines around that, multiple ships. They didn't necessarily have to have a dedicated fighter carrier necessarily, that fires off 80 or 90 peregrines. You can just spread them out in packets in flights or whatever around to support the different ships. I mean, who needs shuttle pods at this point? You need firepower. So, and this is kind of the tactical display of the screen that we see here. So you can see the Klingons on the right flank, and they got mauled by the 5 squadrons of Jem'Hadar fighters. I can only assume that this here is the sun, and these 2 are the inhabited worlds that the Federation and the Romulans were heading towards. And so the Feds and the Roms were very much engaged in the with the various orbital platforms. And then that's also a fairly cool shot of an Akira getting slaughtered as it cartwheels across the screen. And for the most part, these orbital platforms don't really even seem to absorb very much damage from the ships as they get shot at. So what ends up happening is that Garrick notices that none of these platforms have their own power source, and then he traces that back to say that they don't generate their own power, and the power is being transmitted to the weapons platforms, and that helps give them very strong shields. So he figures out that, hey, this is on that power. All that power is being generated on an asteroid. So now by this time, Sisko is out of the fight. Once Jadzia got killed and the wormhole closed up, I think it was something like when they're aligned, it was like thousands of wormhole to aliens suddenly cried out and then went silent. I don't know. I might be mixing up my movies or something like that. But so Kira ends up taking over. So this ends up affecting Sisko. He's out of the fight. Kira takes over, orders an attack, and a bunch of ships break off and go after this asteroid. And even after everybody fires all their weapons and everything, they don't even dent the shields on this asteroid. So it's still got a really strong shield generator.
So is it my imagination, by the way, that with this beamed power thing, they totally and completely changed the implications of this universe just to have a little plot point happen in one random episode?
Could be.
I mean, think about the implications of that. And one of the things the standards that I always use for things like this is where should we have seen this previously?
Right.
And there's lots of places where there's lots of implications of things like beamed power through subspace that we've never seen any of the follow-on effects that one would expect from that.
Yeah.
And if the Cardassians can do it, anybody can.
Well, actually, I would be willing to bet that. I mean, we could sit here and argue that it was probably the Dominion that gave them the technology and the ability to do that.
Could be, but
because the Dominion are clearly more technologically advanced,
yes,
even than most of than anybody.
But I will note there's no surprise on the part of anybody along the lines of they can do that. Nobody seems to think that this is something along the line, that this is something noteworthy other than, oh yeah, this gives us an opportunity. Nobody seems to go like, huh, that's interesting. Never seen that before.
Yeah. Well, I would argue that it was very easily defeated. And so maybe the reason we don't see this again is, you get the one-time surprise thing, and then the opponent gets to adapt to it, and your thing is no longer that much of a surprise. Because, O'Brien has the idea to imprint the Federation warp signatures on the asteroid, and which leads to this.
And that also is an interesting trick that it's amazing. All the really good tricks are things that somebody thinks of in the heat of a battle and they implement over the course of 30 seconds.
Yeah, right. And we both know that, that's a dramatic thing, right? I mean, all this winning a battle is actually about training and drilling and leadership and practice and having the right doctrine and, guessing right on what your tactics are going to be when you're going into something new, and probably a host of other things, but So yeah, in this case, all the platforms then turn and fire on the asteroid and end up destroying it. They, of course, all peel off. The destruction of the asteroid means they all power down. And then that allows the Federation ships to go around and blow them up and take them over. And then Wayoon says something like, you Cardassians are really turning out to be a disappointment. And, this is an unmitigated disaster because Gul Dukat was, of course, out there running around his own little strategy. He ends up closing up the wormhole. And Wayoon makes the point of saying that Federation soldiers are landing on Chintaka now. So clearly there is there are Federation ground forces. It's not merely Starfleet officers who happen to be planet side with the phaser. So unless he is implying that it's just Federation security guards, I would say that if you're invading a planet, there were probably some form of troop transports, or even the Galaxy class could be loaded. If you could carry 1,000 crew members plus 4,000 to 5,000 family members on board your ship, you just swap that out for bunks and put a bunch of Marines on board the ship, and you can beam them down. So it turns out the first Battle of Chintaka ends up being a big victory for the Allies, and their special. Now they did pay a heavy price. It was definitely a costly thing for them to take it. And then later on, we see the siege of AR 559, I think, but I don't remember the numbers, so don't quote me on that. And then there'll be a second Battle of Chintaka. So we'll go on with that in later episodes. And I think that pretty much concludes things for tonight's talk.
Well, actually, let's talk a little bit more, because I was thinking about some of the things that I noticed in this episode that struck me a little. Recurring things with Star Trek, shall we say, and you sort of see it generally in science fiction TV shows, but Star Trek especially. I noted the part where Admiral Ross says, "And Starfleet has picked you to plan the invasion." And so this tells me that this isn't a case of like, we're going to take a plan that we've already been working on and use it. It really sort of sounds like they're not starting from scratch. They're, they have to plan it. It's not just we've got a off the shelf plan.
Well, one thing I'll say is and I don't remember his name, but essentially like the D-Day invasion, the initial plan was done by a colonel, an Army colonel. And he's the one that did the an awful lot of the big thoughts on that. It certainly got fine-tuned by a lot of people.
But yeah, and the big thoughts for the strategy for World War II was a colonel and a couple of guys, and did it over the course of about 2 weeks. But there was a lot of details that needed to be filled in to turn these sort of big picture ideas into actually something that's. The strategy can be a small number of people working over a relatively fast period of time. To go through the operational side of things to an actual tactically executable plan requires an awful lot of detail.
Absolutely.
If nothing else, you have to think about things like, we're going to put ground troops on the ground. How do we support them?
Mm-hmm.
How do we if nothing else, there's a logistics effort that you have to make happen. And these things are planned by staffs, and Cisco doesn't have one, basically.
Well, we don't see it. I've always just kind of assumed that it's not just him sitting in his office for 2 hours and like, yep, I got it. It's all done. We're good. We're saved.
Yeah. Okay.
but they don't have time to show that stuff. That's just how I have chosen to believe it.
Okay. So,
I mean, we never see anybody go to the bathroom either, but we can assume that probably people do that sort of thing too. So,
yeah, that makes sense. I just have a little bit of a problem because like in Babylon 5, you see them plan an operation.
We see them go to the bathroom once too.
That's true. That's true. We do. At least once. But we see them plan an operation. Now, when they actually get to the tactical execution of it, it gets kind of stupid, because they spend all their time saying, Sheridan saying things like little ships cover big ships, etc., when it should have been execute Alpha 4. right? Because it's a plan. They've got pre-planned responses. They should have worked out all the details on who's going to do what. And it's just a matter of saying, like, okay, this is the one we're going to implement, based upon what I see when I get into the system. I've looked around and we're going to do this one. But it would have been nice to see a little bit. You don't have to see it. It would be nice if they had sort of acknowledged the fact that it was happening.
Yeah. I kind of think of all those guys in that discussion with the Klingons and the Romulans in the briefing room, all those guys standing in the background. Those were the staff officers, because I've been that guy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say the Marines actually can plan an operation pretty quickly. I don't know how they do it currently, but it used to be that they basically had a bunch of laminated stuff in binders, and so it was all worksheet based. Well, I never worked with the Marines. I only had this described to me, but it was all worksheet based. And so, like, you're filling in things here on the beginning of it. Then you go to the next page and it's like, okay, the answer to that determines, that's the multiplier for these things. And you go through the planning process. And by the end, you're able to say, okay, for this operation, we're going to need this type of forces, et cetera, et cetera. We have the capability of doing that from within the forces we have here, except we might need to call in for some extra support from the Navy or whatever, and they can just sort of turn the crank and do it. So I'll give them that, but I just wish there was a little bit more of stuff like that in this situation.
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, we would love to see under the hood in a lot of things, right? I mean. I
don't even necessarily have to see under the hood. I just like to hear somebody refer to the fact that they have an engine underneath the hood and the engine does stuff, as opposed to just like, we magically just move from point A to point B. How does that happen?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm being anal retentive about this, but I will admit that.
Yeah. So. Oh, it's the Siege of AR 558. Yes. Thanks, Bob.
Yes, that sounds right.
So, and that's another good episode. The other thing we never see ground vehicles. It's always just troops with weapons. And we do see a little bit of ground combat. We see the Siege of AR 558, but there's also the one during the Federation Klingon War. Where the Klingons are fighting and the Feds are fighting on the surface and stuff like that too. So, what was it? Nor the Battle to the Strong, I think, is the episode, and I thought that's a good one too. And there they talk about, hey, there's all these jammers and you can't beam anything anywhere, and communications are essentially down, and they try to fly shuttles in, they call them hoppers, and they get shot down, and so it strikes me as maybe it's too lethal of an environment to have a vehicle. Maybe a vehicle just attracts too much attention and gets slaughtered. But I would assume you could put big shields on the thing. So
could be.
I don't know. I don't know what the implications of shielding on the surface of a planet in an atmosphere and all that stuff are. But but we never see it is the point. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but we don't see it.
So oh well. Well, that was pretty much what I wanted to say about it from what I saw.
All right. Sounds good. Well, we are about 10 minutes over, so I think this would be a good time to sign off and say goodnight, everybody. Take care.
All right. See you later, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye.